Shannon's Lumber Industry Update.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. It's episode 129, and we're doing this month's featured species, Sweet Chestnut, Castanea sativa. But first, as usual, a little bit of business to discuss. Thank you for everybody who sponsored the show this month. I had quite a few new people join on at patreon.com/lumberupdate. Those of you who sponsored at the walnut tier level will be getting this fancy little information bumper sticker. I don't know if anybody's putting these on their bumpers, but Sweet Chestnut sticker for the month. Also a reminder for those of you who sponsored the show last month as well, I have not sent out those cottonwood stickers. I was specifically waiting, knowing that episode just came out, to plug them in with the chestnut stickers and send them all at once. So you'll be getting a twofer in the mail in hopefully a couple of days, depending on where you are in this wonderful wide world. In fact, I got to say, I've got quite a few international, certainly a lot of international listers, but I've got a lot of international sponsors who are getting these stickers now. So thank you for that. Also, thank you for all the emails I've been getting, not only some news and feedback, but some really, really great questions. My inbox has certainly been filling up. My Instagram has been filling up, and the online forum had a whole bunch of new submissions to it. So thank you so much. I've still got to kind of filter through all those and kind of plug them into the show. But as always, keep those questions coming. You can go to lumberupdate.com and fill out the contact form there. You can also just email me at at lumberupdate@gmail.com, or just hit me up on Instagram at lumberupdateshow. Any of those ways can get questions to me. And of course, if you are a Patreon supporter, you can also submit questions via direct message on the Patreon platform. I see those as well. Lots of different ways, in other words, to get in touch with me. So, little bit, I don't know if we call this industry news, but yeah, kind of industry news, but like a chance meeting. I went out for a bike ride the other day. It has been stupid hot, like all over the United States. But out here in Maryland, it's been like 98, 104 degrees Fahrenheit and like the same humidity, just oppressively hot. And finally broke, and I got a chance to get on my bike and just go for a ride. No training, no intervals, nothing, just out for a spin. And I went down one of our local kind of gravel trails and ended up at a park, and I saw a dawn redwood, and it's always just such a beautiful tree. I know they're kind of all over the place now, but teeny tiny little cones, and they're lovely and soft, and they just look really pretty. And right next to it was a bald cypress, and kind of similar morphology between the two trees, but it was nice to see them side by side. Bald cypress has small cones, but they're still probably like ping pong size compared to like the marble size of a dawn redwood. And it was really nice. And I was taking pictures, and some guy like came out of the trees, like emerged from the pine needles of an eastern white pine and an oak tree. And he's kind of like, "Oh, you like trees, huh?" And I was like, "Oh, no, I run a lumber podcast. I'm a woodworker. Absolutely love trees." And it was nice because he immediately, when he heard I was a woodworker, he's like, "Well, you don't want to take those down, do you?" He's like, "Oh, you're a woodworker. I'm a local forester. I want to talk to you." I was like, "Oh, okay." And this brings up kind of my point of this. He is a forester for the county that I live in, and there's a couple of them on staff, and kind of one of his responsibilities is paying attention to the trees in the specific public parks, but he also manages a list of maybe, I don't want to say undesirable, but invasive species, and what are they doing? Particularly the invasive species that propagate pretty wildly. Like black locust is a good example of a tree that can be almost parasitic in nature. It can co-opt another tree's roots, kill that tree, and reproduce itself on that other tree's root structure. So he pays attention to those things and makes sure they don't get out of control. And we were talking about just some of the urban logging that I've been talking about. I was asking him what kind of like concession management, what kind of silvicultural planning they do. And he admitted that there's still a lot of it in its infancy, and they're still working a lot of it out in the particular county. But one thing he does pay attention to are the trees that maybe are sick or are invasive and causing a problem. and when they need to take them down. And he said, in most instances, we need to take them down like whenever we can. But of course, it's expensive to remove a tree. If it's in a public park, that can sometimes cause park closures, which is not good for the public. They try not to do that. And oftentimes they have to end up putting things out for bid for tree removal companies to come out and take these down. Then I said, I've got a lot of woodworkers, a lot of arborists, a lot of sawmill owners that listen to my show who are always looking for these urban lumber sources. And he actually said they maintain a list of people who are interested in using the tree for lumber rather than just taking down and destroying it. And that's where they would rather the tree go. They don't want it to be turned into mulch. They don't want it to end up, in a landfill. And they want to give essentially preference to the person who is going to saw it into boards. And they've thought about getting a sawmill themselves, but it's just not really in the budget. They don't really have the manpower or the staff to do it. So I put him in touch with a few local guys that I know, and he was incredibly thankful. And it just reminded me that, I'm in this business. I'm in the business of this podcast, and I know a lot of mobile sawmill owners. I know a lot of small band mill owners. And I kind of assume sometimes that, well, if I know a bunch, you must know a bunch. And that's so not the case. This guy, while he was aware of kind of the urban forestry movement, was not aware that there were quite so many people out there who would be interested in sawing a tree into boards. And if I remember correctly, the conversation was something along the lines of, I just wish I could get people to take these trees and use them for boards rather than mulching them up. And I kind of looked at him like, what, are you kidding? Of course there's lots of people. And it was connecting those dots that really kind of highlighted to me that this is not necessarily a common fact. Traditionally turning trees into boards was a thing of industry with a big sawmill. When you think of sawmill and a big giant circular saw, that's what he was thinking. And this more mobile, easily adaptable, heck, most band mills are cheaper than a car, like way cheaper than a car. You can get a really, really, really good band mill for $6,000. You cannot get a car for $6,000. So, that was a bit of a paradigm shift in his mind, and putting him in touch with a few guys, I think we're going to be able to get them into some of the trees from our local parks. Now, of course, here's the other thing, the city would rather not, pay out a bunch of money to a tree service to remove this tree. So I'm sorry for those of you in the tree service business. That doesn't mean that you're not necessarily going to get those contracts. There are still lots of trees in their silvicultural plan that need to come down that aren't really, good lumber wood or necessarily want to be set aside for that. But there is something to be said about the people that are going to turn it into boards. Now, it's every chance that you're not going to get it for free, but you are going to have to go in and do the work. So if you're not able to fell the tree, you might need to contract someone who can fell the tree. You probably won't be able to mill it right there on site in public parklands. You're going to have to be able to deal with it. But the important thing is start the conversation. Reach out to your local, your state, but certainly your county or even city parks department and find out if they have foresters on staff, if they have any kind of plan, and tell them what you want. I'm looking for lumber, and I'd love to be able to help you out with any of the invasive trees or even sick trees that you may have in your concession, if you will, in your inventory. And you might be surprised what kind of inroads you might make, what kind of relationships you might make. It may not yield anything right away, but what he was telling me is my name is now on a list. And I told him, look, I don't have a bandsaw mill. I would love to have one. I don't have the space. I don't have the covenants to allow me to do that in my neighborhood. But he's like, still, if we're coming down to a tree that needs to be removed, I want to reach out to you because you might be able to point someone to me. And selfishly, I'm thinking I might be able to point you to someone, and I might also be able to get a couple of pieces of wood when the person I pointed to saws it up. So it could be a resource for me to get lumber. And you can look at it the same way. If you're listening to this and you're like, well, I don't have, a sawmill, I'd love one, but I'm not there yet. It could be a great opportunity for you to connect some dots for some people and get this lumber into the marketplace. So I highly advise you to reach out to your parks department and find out if a forestry plan is already in place. And you know what? Maybe it's not. And maybe it's something where a little community action, a little community awareness might help to establish such a thing in your local city. So this goes back to that episode I did about leaving a legacy and that grassroots movement. And it was just really cool to literally have this guy stumble upon me, and we struck up a great conversation, and it turned into something that could be a great resource. In fact, I'm going to bring him on the show, and we're going to talk about local urban forestry or suburban forestry in my case at that local grassroots level, and maybe have more of a conversation about how you might be able to get involved in that. So stay tuned. We haven't said anything yet. It may be a little bit of time, but still, I'm kind of excited about that. And anybody else who's listening to this who does the same thing, reaches out to your local parks department. If you get anywhere with that, please send me an email, leave me a voicemail. Hell, come on the show if you want and tell me how it went, because I think this is how we start this snowball, if you will. So the next thing I want to do, again, don't really know what to call it, but as you know, in my Cottonwood episode, I recently took a pretty long road trip across the country, and I did several little stops along the way to look at lumber related sites. So if you are watching this in YouTube right now, I'm going to cut to a field report that I did in Pittsburgh. But for those of you listening to the audio, I want to just do a little story about this, about Nicholson Pavers. And if you don't know what those are wooden blocks that they used to pave streets with.
I'm here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on Rosalyn Place. Rosalyn Place has the claim to be the last in-use wooden paved street in America. While there are still quite a few wooden paved streets floating around this country, this is one you can actually drive on. And if you look behind me, there are cars parked up and down this teeny little wooden paved street. Here you can clearly see the ingrained pavers. These are called Nicholson Pavers. It's ingrained blocks that have been treated with creosote. They were employed because they can be cut to shape and therefore be more regular surface than a traditional cobblestone. Here you can see some newer ones that have been maintained. Rosalyn Place is, from what I understand, the only actual wooden street that is still in use. There are wooden streets around the country that you can't actually drive on. And you can see how quickly they would degrade and how rough things could get pretty quickly. The creosote ended up being kind of stinky as well, which didn't exactly make people happy. But they were told that the wooden pavers were quite a bit quieter for the horse-drawn carts across traditional cobblestones. As far as the species, the patent does not include a species for it, but it was whatever was immediately available at the time. Let's come down here and take a closer look, and let's use our wood identification. We're definitely looking at a ring porous tree. It is a hardwood. I would suspect we're talking about some kind of oak here. It would take the creosote nicely. Certainly lots of it growing in and around the Ohio River Valley. That's going to be my guess, but certainly once you put creosote all over it, it's nearly impossible to tell. Because stone had gotten quite inexpensive, the wooden paver became a very affordable alternative. And because the lumber industry was booming at the time in Pittsburgh, they were just bringing in whatever lumber they had locally to create these pavers.
Now, when Rosalyn Place was paved, it wasn't until like 1910, 1913, and the Nicholson paver had already fallen out of fashion because it was considered not durable. The architect and the developer that built Rosalyn Place was in charge of also, dealing with paving the road. And he opted for it because, again, he wanted a quieter, quainter street. And at that point, even in like World War I era, the paver was considered old-timey and like anachronistic, and kind of like throwback retro was a style even back then. And that's what he was really going for. And here it is still, in active use, and the street looked pretty good. Now there's been some repaving and some maintenance and things, but let's be fair, it doesn't get a huge amount of automobile traffic. It's very low speed, well below 20 mile an hour in this little narrow street, and just the residents coming in and out like that. But it was really cool to see, and really cool to dig into the Nicholson paver a little bit more. It was a perfect solution at the time when stone was super, super expensive. And in the late 1800s, lumber was prevalent. It was everywhere. It was a major trade in most of the major cities, certainly in Chicago, most definitely in Philadelphia. That's where the company I work for was at the time, in Philadelphia, bringing in lumber. In fact, we probably supplied a lot of the oak that they used for the Nicholson pavers in Philadelphia. I could look up some ledgers and probably find an account that proves me right, or maybe proves me wrong. But it was really interesting to see how street engineers responded to available materials. And, while there may be some durability concerns there, being able to pave and repave the streets substantially cheaper than it was with stone in places like Pittsburgh and Chicago and Philadelphia was a cool solution. And what I love is that these streets are still there today. So are they less durable? Well, yeah, when you look at like the standard traffic flow, when you look at the weight of your average car and SUV today, yeah, it's probably not durable. But for pedestrian lanes, for small side streets that see very low speed residential traffic, is it a potential? Is it a possibility to use a more renewable resource for a modern street engineer? I know nothing about street engineering. I imagine there's a lot of problems to this, but in your historical cities or in those pedestrian malls where there is no traffic other than, bikes and foot traffic, what a cool look that would be. And the more we talk about renewability of wood, sustainability of wood in modern architecture, and how that is really the most sustainable building material, how cool would it be to extend from a mass timber in the roof in the building to a thermally modified cladding to wooden pavers on the sidewalk itself? Certainly would be aesthetically very appealing. Certainly would capture that retro, probably hipster vibe of today. But I challenge city planners out there to consider the Nicholson paver. Could it be an option for these non-automobile traffic type streets? Could it be an option for a bike path? I don't know. Frost heave might be a problem. I don't know that I'd want to take my 28 millimeter tires on that, but my 30, 32, and even my gravel tires, I'd be perfectly happy with that. So I'm curious if any of you have run across these wooden paved streets, what you think of them, and if you have any experience with them themselves. And if you are a city planner and wants to tell me that I'm full of it, please let me know. I want to know all about why the Nicholson paver wouldn't make a good solution for a non-automobile traffic pedestrian mall type option. Okay, let's move on to our featured species this month. That is the sweet chestnut or the European chestnut. Botanical name is Castanea sativa. Very close cousin to the American chestnut, Castanea dentata. In fact, kind of difficult to tell them apart. In general, the European species, European chestnut, European oak, European, walnut, the European variants tend to be, like oak is a good example. It's the exact same species. White oak in Europe and white oak here, for the most part, is Quercus alba. You'll find some Quercus regia and things like that in Europe. But in general, European species tend to be a little bit darker in color, a little bit denser, a little bit tighter growth ring, just due to the wetter climate that produces slower growing hardwoods. The same would go for sweet chestnut. Now, I have done some work with American chestnut, and I've mentioned the chestnut blight in the past. It definitely was almost entirely wiped out, and no one has really found a good solution for bringing it back. But there are still some examples of it, and there are some resistant strains that have been cultivated. And I've been able to buy American chestnut from a couple of people around the country, mostly people out west, and I built several projects from it. Very similar to working with a red or a white oak. I was very fortunate to be able to get my hands on some European chestnut or sweet chestnut and do a little work with that. I built a couple of boxes from it, did a little bit of turning. I made a spindle blank out of it. Well, it was a pepper mill, to be perfectly honest, but I'm a furniture guy. It's a spindle blank, but it was a pepper mill. And I've had a couple of customers at my day job who specifically wanted a European chestnut floor. So I didn't do the work, but I was observing it being milled and talking to my mill guys and getting their feedback on it as well. And for the most part, I think it's safe to say that the sweet chestnut is a little bit more mellow to work with than the American chestnut. The crazy part is, and one of the reasons I wanted to highlight this is it's an unusual tree for me here in North America, but it's everywhere in Europe. And particularly in England, it has quite a following. Great Britain uses it for cladding all the time. They use it for a great deal of green woodworking and bushcraft. Also, it is a particularly useful tree for Coppice Forestry, which I'm going to get into a little bit later. But let's talk the technical details right now. Let's get into the nitty-gritty here. It's got, an oak-like look to it. It's a large ring porous wood, so it's got that very grainy look like oak. It's got, I'd say, closer to a red oak than a white oak. White oak tends to be a little bit more mellow brown with kind of some grayish hues to it, whereas red oak is that mellow brown with reddish hues to it. It is about 690 Janka hardness, and if I remember correctly, American Chestnut is about 500-ish. So as to be expected, a little bit denser tree, a little bit harder than that. MOR 10,300, MOE 1.25 million. TR ratio of 1.6, a little bit more stable than what you would think of American Chestnut would be, and it's about 37 pounds per cubic foot dried. So that's about 3 pounds heavier than American red oak. I don't off the top of my head have American Chestnut, but it's going to be very, very similar there. Again, it's a ring porous wood, large, very large solitary pores, oftentimes 2 to 3 deep in that ring porous ring. And then parenchyma is diffuse and aggregate. They form like vertical lines that you'll see in between the medullary rays. Medullary rays are quite large, but you don't really get that white oak or red oak kind of flecking on the quarter sawn faces much. I have some examples that I'll show to the video watchers here. It is definitely an exterior wood. You will find tylose very frequent, stuffed into the pores, and that's where it's gains its fame in Great Britain as exterior solid wood cladding, is its exterior durability. So yeah, you find it a lot in furniture and cabinetry, much more kind of utilitarian type furniture, very similar to like red oak here in the US. Used for exterior round wood like fence posts and things like that. And I'll get back to that again when we start talking about Coppice Forestry. So yeah, you'll find it in like public parks, playground fixtures, things like that. Hold on. I've got a whole bunch of notes here on usage. There's actually, because there's so much popularity to the sweet chestnut, and well, one thing I'm forgetting is that it's cultivated for its chestnuts. That's why it's called the sweet chestnut. Round stock for coppicing. In the coppicing stuff, it's used for fences and woven hurdles. Lots and lots and lots and lots of cladding. And one of the other things that's useful in cladding is you can get, the tree will grow big enough to give you wider boards if necessary. Length sometimes tends to be a problem, but oftentimes you find them as finger jointed, and that very grainy appearance means you can finger joint relatively invisibly. And that shows up a fair bit there. It's about 100-foot tall tree, or 30 meters, 5 to 7 foot diameter trunk, about 2 meter diameter trunk, cultivated widely for the nut. Actually also used to produce honey. I've never had sweet chestnut honey. Now, because it's a ring porous wood, the wood does split quite readily. And because of that, similar to oak or American chestnut, you do need to be very cautious and slow as you dry it, because it can be prone to shake due to that. What I have for the video watchers, and I'll do my best to describe it for the audio, I've got a piece of American red oak, Quercus rubrum. I have a piece of American white oak, Quercus alba. This side actually has a little bit of finish on it. This side is raw. Very similar in appearance. Again, I find that it is interesting. The white oak in this lighting appears a little bit redder than the red oak. And then I have a piece of American chestnut. Very, very similar. It's a little bit grainier. Here's a better example of a more open grain, wider growth ring oak as compared to the chestnut. Very, very similar in appearance. Here is European chestnut or sweet chestnut. Very, very similar in appearance. You would be hard pressed to tell these apart. There's a little bit of difference in the end grain. Again, my lighting, I'm being fancy with my lighting. It casts a bit of a greenish hue in here. I think you will find that the European chestnut just is a little bit more brown. Going off of the growth rings and the density of the growth rings, I don't think is the best choice. This board that I have in my hand does appear to have tighter growth rings than the other board that is American Chestnut. A lot of that is just how it's cut from the tree. Certainly, I would expect a slower growing European tree to have closer together growth rings, but I really think that anytime you're looking for density of growth rings as an identifier, you're going to find 1,000 exceptions to the rule. So I think the point is this is a featured species that can span, multiple continents here. You're going to find it a lot easier over in Europe and particularly the UK because the tree grows like mad and there was no chestnut blight there. But I'm finding more and more options for American chestnut here in North America, and I didn't have to look that far to find European chestnut. Now, I didn't have a huge selection when I found it, but it is out there. If you do a little bit of Googling, you can find it. Heck, you can find it in Great Britain and people will actually ship it to you overseas, but gets a little bit expensive there. I can tell you from my experience, it is a fantastic alternative, go figure, to oak. And I think red oak in particular has gotten a very bad rap because a lot of times red oak is dried too quickly. The big box stores have given red oak a bad name. Certainly Riven red oak is a genuine pleasure to work with. Air dried red oak is a genuine pleasure to work with. Chestnut is just mellower. It's not quite as grainy. It's not quite as splintery as red oak. And it does have a little bit more interest in the color and the grain itself. Certainly is much softer, about half the softness of red oak and white oak, and quite a bit easier to work. And I just had a wonderful experience. I built a chest with all sliding dovetail joint on the inside, and cutting those dovetail sockets is normally quite a challenge. And I really, really enjoyed working in chestnut. So it's one of those woods that falls in the middle of the color spectrum. It's kind of brown, it's grainy, it's very wood looking, like the stereotypical version of wood. Like if you ask AI to create a wood background for you, it's going to create something that looks like oak. But this just adds a little bit of extra character to it. And when you finish it, it is grainy enough that, like, if you want a highly glossy finish, you're going to need to pour fill it. But I think you'll find that it's much easier to work with, much easier to finish than the much larger poured red oaks, maybe not so much white oak. But I don't know. I just found it different enough that it was enough of a departure from red oak. And I will admit, I'm not a big fan of red oak. I don't particularly like building furniture from red oak. White oak, different story. But what I like about white oak versus red oak is that slightly denser, tighter ringed, more mellow color than you get with red oak. And this is really where chestnut, both European chestnut and American chestnut, can foot the bill. For me, I think if you can get your hands on some real nice European chestnut that is a little bit browner, a little bit redder than the American stuff, all the better. So certainly from an alternative species, we're talking, American chestnut, we're talking American oak, white or red, closer to red, European oak, European ash also would be good. Most ring porous woods are going to have some effect. High tannin content in the chestnut, which also does help make it an exterior species, but be very cautious of your ferrous fasteners. Use only stainless fasteners. This stuff will stain pretty substantially. So I wanted to talk a little bit about coppicing, because when you look at coppicing, the American chestnut comes up time and time again. So let me jump into questions, because I have a question from Stephen that asks about coppicing, and it's a perfect segue since we're talking about European chestnut here. Stephen says that ages back, in your episode, ages ago, you were talking about different types of forest management, and you mentioned how coppicing is frequently used in the UK to get useful sizes of lumber from a tree by cutting a tree somewhat above ground level and letting it grow back from the roots. I have a wonderful image here that I can show on video, but essentially, yes, what we have is a tree that, there's three different forestry practices here: coppicing, pollarding, and something called daisugi in Japan. So coppicing, and if you're watching the video, the image on the left is coppice, the image on the right is pollard. So coppicing involves cutting the tree right back down to the trunk, like like level with the ground. So the trunk is flush with the ground. And then all the shoots of the tree will sprout out from that trunk, and you get like 20 little trees coming out of that existing trunk using the existing root structure. And this grows very quickly, very fast, because you've got, well-established roots. As the tree grows and it puts down roots, those roots spread out. And the older the tree gets, the more established the roots structure is, and the more capable that root structure is of pulling in nutrients to feed the tree. So if you've got, this nutrient superhighway and these fast growing little shoots anyway, those shoots are going to grow up real quick, and you get, a lot of like 2 and 3 inch diameter trees sprouting out of this trunk. Pollarding is when we cut the tree back, but we still leave a bit of the trunk. It may be 3 feet. It could be 6 feet of the trunk. And those little shoots sprout out of the top of that trunk. And we do this, maybe it's a tree that needs sunlight. So you cut the tree off high enough that when those shoots come up, they're getting plenty of sunlight. And the shade from the trees around it are not hindering their growth. The other thing is from livestock management, you're keeping those little shoots up off the ground so the livestock can't eat it, but it also allows other undergrowth, grasses and things that the livestock do want to eat, for animal husbandry purposes. So pollarding is often used for that specific purpose, for mixed use animal and tree silviculture. Pollarding, it's not, some species are going to work better for others. Some are best for coppicing, some for pollarding. Coppicing got why Great Britain jumped behind it and has historically used it for so many years. I don't know. Maybe they're primarily their livestock are sheep, and maybe they don't eat as much or don't take up as much space as cattle, so they didn't quite need that grassland. I have no idea. I literally just made that up right now. But it's 2 distinct methods, still utilizing an existing root system. Daisugi is a Japanese idea that's similar to pollarding, where you're using an existing trunk. But what daisugi really is focusing on is a tree that you're growing those shoots from the branches. So rather than coming out of the central trunk, the tree has sprouted out and it's got large branches moving out in different directions. So you've basically got this T shape, capital T shape. And the shoots, the new growth, grows up along the top of that capital T. So you've got this really, really wide platform that these straight poles are growing up from. That is generally done with Japanese cypress. Some of the Cryptomerica genre is what that is growing from. And that's really the only softwood that you find lends itself to this type of forestry management. Softwoods in general are not a good idea. So Stephen actually asked this question and said, I've never seen a foresight from a city in the US to use Coppice Forestry, but could this be a useful tool for urban lumber management? Furthermore, I live in northern Georgia, where old growth hasn't been around for a couple of hundred years, and even the old trees today are generally less than 100 years old. So growing back from land cleared for, and they're growing back from land that was cleared for farming. As such, there are a ton of trees, but not a large lumber quality hardwoods. Would coppicing be a better management tool here than selective harvesting and clear cutting I often see? What about for softwoods? And he does ask if I've seen that old picture of a gnarly old tree in Japan. Google daisugi, you will see the picture he's talking about. It's kind of the poster tree of daisugi. So to answer his question, softwoods, no, generally not. If you think about conifers in general, most of them grow in that atypical, Christmas tree shape. Some of them don't. Eastern white pine is a good example. A lot of the western pines, or the ponderosas and things like that, they're just a heck of a lot bigger. But there's a lot of things in softwoods that don't allow them to grow that way, and not all hardwoods will either. The prime coppicing species are alder, ash, oak, hazel, willow, chestnut, lime or basswood here in North America, hornbeam, and black locust. I'm sure I'm missing a few, but those are the ones that in all of my research, they just kept coming up time and time and time again. So in answer to your question, Stephen, is this a possible forestry management solution? I don't think so, because the commercial species, like think of cherry, walnut, oak. Those are not among those. Among those species good for coppicing. There is a massive trade in those hardwoods and many other maple. Why am I forgetting maple? That's what those forests and those selective shelter forestry, even clear cutting to some extent, that's what those silvicultural methods are designed for. Coppicing and pollarding as a silvicultural method is highly effective, but only for certain species and really for certain outcomes. If what you're looking for is a lot of 2 and 3 inch diameter poles, coppicing is a great way to do this. If you have a large sheep industry and you're looking for woven hurdles, hazel, coppicing hazel is fantastic. Most of the hurdles are made out of hazel in Great Britain. We don't have as much sheep grazing in North America. There's not really the demand for it. If there were a demand, say you were making umbrellas, wooden umbrellas, you needed a bunch of 3 inch diameter poles, maybe considering a black locust Coppice forestry method could be really interesting. I know a few umbrella companies. You guys are listening? Those of you who are building with like teak and things like that to be all fancy and exotic, why not consider something like black locust, which might as well be fancy and exotic in North America because it's not a mainstream commercial species. As much as they've tried to make it a mainstream commercial species, it is a species that does grow well from the trunk. And, it's rated for ground contact. That could be an interesting business model. Anybody who's listening, 10% finder's fee coming my way. So you do have to have the right species for this. I have a willow. I'm looking out my window right now. That is an example of coppicing. I didn't know it at the time. It was a willow that I planted shortly after I bought this house nearly 20 years ago. And we had a hurricane blow through quite a while ago, and it topped it. It cracked it right off. I guess technically my tree would be more of a pollarding example. It cracked that tree clean off about 4 feet off the ground. And I had intended to go out and cut the stump back at some point. And I went out like 3 weeks later and there were all these little green shoots coming up. I mean, this was hurricane season, so it was right in the height of growth season. And I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe it'll turn into like, a really stout shrub, but it was green and it was pretty and it was really nice. And because it's a willow, it's, got long frondy leaves that are it's not a weeping willow, but it's, very droopy, and it was really pretty. Well, here I am. I don't know when this was. I could look it up, but like I'm looking at the tree at my window and it's gotta be 80 feet tall up to the top. Willow is a fast growing tree to begin with, but if at 4 feet it snapped off, I have 7 different small shoots or trunks that have grown up from it. Each one of those is now 6 to 8 inches in diameter. And I imagine it was probably 12 years ago when this happened. That's what I'm thinking. That's how fast it grew. So you can imagine, and I actually do need to cut some of them out because they're leaning, and the taller they get, the more they lean. So I need to cut some of those down, and that's going to be very workable lumber to play with. I actually have some willow that I worked with before. I'm looking to get some willow from my own yard for that. So Coppice Forestry Management, pollard forestry management is something that could be beneficial for some cities to consider from an urban growth management perspective. I do understand that there are some limits. Like if the turn cycle can be like 20 to 30 years. You cut it back to the stump. 20 years from now, you can harvest more, depending upon the diameter of what you're looking for. If you're doing coppicing for hazel and making hurdles, you probably have, a couple of years for your turn rate on that. But it could be a way to use the existing rootstock that doesn't involve digging something up, doesn't involve new root structures, possibly uprooting sidewalks, digging into power lines. Like some of these trees, the root structure is there, and we've worked around it with sewer lines and power lines and any buried lines and things like that. I do believe there comes a point where you cut it down and you regrow and cut it down and regrow that eventually it doesn't work anymore. I've read that a couple of places. I don't really have a lot of real evidence to back that up. It's more, one guy's blog says that and another guy's blog says that, and it's probably legit, but again, it's probably going to depend upon the species. So, I said earlier in the show, reach out to your local parks department and find out what kind of forestry they have. And while you're at it, have you ever heard of coppicing or pollarding? Have you considered that as a silvicultural method in our community? Maybe for the right species. I have a willow in my backyard. What else did I say here? Hazel, I haven't seen a lot of that, but I'm not real good at identifying hazel. Lime or basswood is everywhere. And I think of the number of people who plant basswood in like commercial parking lots because it's a pretty ornamental tree. Well, those get cut down pretty readily. If we could coppice that, it might actually be a better solution. So think about that. A great question, Stephen. I'm glad you brought that up. I've been meaning to talk about it for a while. If anybody has experience with coppicing or pollarding, or hell, daisugi for that matter, please write in. I would love to hear about pros, cons, if you think I'm crazy, etc. As usual, if you think I'm crazy, please write in. I always like to hear I'm crazy because I firmly believe that too. Moving on to another question here. This is from Alex. He says, I just inherited some good looking lumber, but of course, I have no idea of its provenance. Since according to your podcast, there can be significant difference in how air dried versus kiln dried lumber responds to climate changes, is there a way to tell the difference? Easiest method to do this is take a moisture reading. Air dried lumber. Now this, if you're in Arizona, it's not quite the same, but in most places in the world, air dried lumber will not get very low. Out here on the East Coast, your air dried lumber is going to be 12 to 15%. It's going to be like, if it's thoroughly dried, it's going to be in equilibrium. If you run into lumber that is 6% and under, it has been kiln dried. As I said, Arizona, it's possible to get it, but it still takes quite a long time to air dry down to 0%. In fact, when it does, if it is allowed to do that, it generally checks like crazy as well. As you dry wood, whether it's air or kiln, in the early stages when we're dumping moisture, we've got the free water out of there. It's probably at 25%. You put it in a kiln and you're starting to remove that bound water. You'll get it down to 12% pretty quickly. And you'll get it down maybe to 10% in some climates, but you have to apply a significant amount of heat to get it down below 10% and certainly down to 0% where most dehumidification kilns take it before reversing the case hardening, re-injecting moisture back in and bringing it slowly back up to 6 to 8%. Once you get below 10% and 8%, there is a hardening of the cell wall that happens. When I talk about the workability difference between kiln dried and air dried, it is that hardening of the cell wall. That's what makes kiln dried, air quotes for the video, for the audio listeners, more stable than air dried because the cell wall is just harder. It's not going to absorb moisture as readily and it's going to shed moisture faster. So passing storms don't really do much to kiln dried lumber, whereas a slightly spongier, more pliable air dried cell wall will absorb moisture more readily from that passing storm and hang on to it longer when that storm goes away. That's also what makes the workability of air dried lumber so lovely. It planes beautifully. Anybody who's turned green lumber on a lathe and you see those long ribbons like shooting off, it's not quite that way with air dried lumber, but with a hand plane, it can be very much that way. The color is so much more vibrant in air dried lumber because as you kiln dry and you do harden that cell wall, you're also kind of crystallizing and in some instances extracting some of the tannins and the other extractives that give it that added color. You're baking it, you're hardening it, you're causing chemical reactions that will send those extractives somewhere else, either out of the wood or bonded with something else during that heat process. As the hemicellulose starts to harden and crystallize, you're changing the color as well. All that stuff, when you get it down to 0%, is what's happening. So if you're trying to figure out if these two boards, if one is air dried and one's kiln dried or whatever, take some moisture readings. If you're getting moisture readings at 12%, there's a strong chance that it is air dried. If a storm goes through, typical summer thunderstorm, and you get a violent storm for a couple of hours, go to your shop and measure the moisture. And if it is 15% and then it drops back down to 12, after the storm, it's air dried. If you're going to see greater fluctuations in that moisture, it's air dried. Strong possibility that it's air dried. Certain species, you can just look at it and see, oh, look at all the colors, look at all the variants. It's probably air dried. But then other species are going to throw you for a loop. You're going to pick up a piece of rainbow poplar and think, oh, it's air dried, and it's probably kiln dried. The biggest thing is you have to take moisture measurements and observe how it responds as the atmosphere around it changes. If you're getting, if you're graphing it over, a couple of weeks and it's this spiky graph because it's constantly going up and down and up and down and up and down, it's air dried. Kiln dried is going to be much more of a flat line. You might see a gradual trend upwards over 4 or 5 days of constant rain, but you're unlikely to see more than 1% or 2% change in the moisture content. Whereas air dried could shoot up 5%, could shoot up 8%. A lot of this all depends upon where you are in the country, certainly. If you are in the deserts of Arizona and you have air-dried lumber, it's probably going to end up being like kiln-dried lumber just after one summer day because the temperatures are about the same for those of you down in Phoenix in that area. So great question. It's not, pardon the lumber pun, it's not quite as cut and dried as look at this and you can tell if it's air-dried. It requires some ongoing measurements in order to really get an answer. And even then, it might be the most, comprehensive answer. It may not be the most convincing answer. You might still have a little bit of uncertainty in it. Someone knows a better way, let me know. I'd love to hear it. Next question comes from Misha. He was on vacation in the Olympic Peninsula doing some hiking, and he ran across a tree. And those of you watching the video, I'm going to pull this image up. For those of you listening, it's a giant western red cedar. Think Olympic Peninsula, Pacific Northwest temperate rainforest, moss everywhere, big, straight western red cedar with a very, very straight bark section peeled off. So all the bark is missing from about a 6 to 8 inch wide swath all the way up the tree. Somebody just came along, cut it, and peeled away that one strip. And he was asking, what gives? What's up with this? Well, western red cedar has a lot of traditional uses. And in the national parks, I don't know if he was in Olympic or somewhere in a state park up in the Pacific Northwest, the indigenous tribes actually have access to go in and harvest bark and even harvest some of the western red cedars for traditional practices, whether it be just living, in traditional ways, or for education and keeping these heritage crafts and things like this alive. Moreover, there's also some traditional native, indigenous, aboriginal, whatever word you want to use, silvicultural practices that are still being allowed to be practiced in some of our state and national forest lands because, well, they did it long before us greedy Europeans came over and colonized all this. So traditional uses for cedar bark, it's certainly prized for its durability, flexibility, and water resistance. It's peeled from trees with straight trunks, making a single cut and then pulling upward on the trunk. And that just peels it all away. So you're standing down at ground level and you're just pulling outward and it's peeling away all the way up to the top, and you can kind of rip it off like a long piece of toilet paper or something like that. The strips can be as long as 27 feet. They're carefully separated into layers. Soft fibers have been used for clothing, mats, napkins, towels. Weavers can create baskets, hats from narrow strands of cedar bark. Cedar roots are often dug and used for basket making. So many of the native peoples do not have these cedar trees on their reservations. Let's not open that can of worms. But they're on these national forest lands. So they have specific dispensation to go in and harvest these trees for those usage. And honestly, the protocols say how much can be taken. And in the case of the western red cedar, like if you stripped all the bark off, the tree would probably die. That's its natural defense. But stripping that one section of bark off, the tree has been proven to just kind of shrug that off. It might have a couple of slow years as it recovers from that, but it will recover from that if you take off that one strip. So for the most part, when you see it this way, it's an indigenous practice is doing it. It's not any kind of commercial harvestry. We see this with ash. We see this with hickory for chair makers and things like that. But they also tend to take down the whole tree and use the heartwood itself to make the chair. But if you've ever seen a hickory bark woven seat, it's a similar practice is being used, but we're also taking the tree. This is an instance where we're leaving the tree and using the bark for a whole bunch of stuff. You'll find that bark in general has all kinds of uses, medicinal uses, textile uses, all kinds of things that is not wood. Well, I mean, technically it's wood, right? Because it grew on a tree. But you get the point. That cambium layer, that bark layer has a lot of different uses for it. So I thought it was particularly cool that Misha found this example right there in the forest of an indigenous tribe going in, grabbing just what they needed, and that tree recovering and continuing to grow. And the tree in the image is, Lord knows how big it is, but it's a big one. It's a very, what you would expect a Western red cedar to look like. So great question, Misha. Thank you so much for bringing that to my attention and to all of us here. So with that, I'm going to close this episode. And again, remind you that if you have questions, please send them to me. I build this show around your questions. Go to lumberupdate.com to get the show notes for this, but also to submit your questions via the contact form. Email me at lumberupdate@gmail.com for those questions as well, or hit me up on Instagram at lumberupdateshow.com. And if you want to be one of the cool kids and get the Sweet Chestnut information sticker, become a Patreon supporter at the walnut tier or higher, and you're going to get it in the mail. Just make sure you give me your address. A couple of you guys have forgotten that. Anybody who becomes a sponsor in the month of July will be getting the sticker. So the month is quickly coming to a close. If you want this sticker, act fast. Otherwise, we will see you next time, folks. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sending in your questions. Thanks for just putting up with me as I ramble on about trees and wood. So go buy some lumber, or better yet, reach out to your local parks department and see if you can help them get rid of some of their tree inventory in the form of lumber. Hey, y'all.